So we can think of a social structure as the enduring patterned relationships between various elements of society which are outside of our immediate reach and beyond our individual control. So capitalism is a social structure. As I talked about last time, I can't change the fact that we have agreed that certain forms of currency allow us to buy things, that we need jobs to get those forms of currency. You know, I could wake up and say, I hate this, and I still have to come to work because I have to pay for my house, because I have to eat. You know, there's all these things that force me, and I don't hate this, but there's all these things that force me to do something in order to get money so that I can live. You know, that's part of the structure of our society. We can think about education as a social structure. We can think about religion. We can think about the social welfare system, which Malcolm has experience with. Each of these conforms to this definition that things are beyond our individual reach and outside of our individual control. And most of these patterns have endured for a long time in society and affect our lives. You know, we can see the way that the same social structure can influence one person's life negatively and one person's life positively, right? So we can look at race with Malcolm X and see the way that for him, this social structure of race was negatively impacting him. And we can look at his white classmates and see the way that it was positively influencing their experiences in the same way that being like a straight white man influences somebody's life positively, whereas, you know, being a black lesbian might change those kinds of ideas. So we have all these social structures, and all these things influence our lives. But in the United States, we almost completely ignore these, and we focus on individual experiences. So sociologists do not say the only thing that is important are social structures. Sociologists say that we also need to think about human agency, so the actions of individuals or groups in society. So human agency then are the choices that we make, the things that we decide to do. Because sociologists don't just care about social structures. Sociologists don't just care about human agency, but sociologists care about these things together. And so this ties in with the reading by Mills for today. You know, how are these concepts of structure and agency related to the personal troubles and public issues that Mills talks about in today's reading? You know, Mills is talking about personal troubles and public issues, and structure and agency are just different ways of viewing the same basic thing, right? So when Mills is talking about these personal troubles, you know, he says if one person out of 1,000 doesn't have a job, it might have been 100,000. If one person doesn't have a job, then that is a personal trouble. That's a choice, you know, it's related to something about that individual person, when everybody has a job except them. But when millions of people don't have jobs, we can't look at those millions of people and say, well, what's wrong with all of them? Because there must be something wrong with the structure that is preventing them from having jobs. You know, there's something about the economy at that time. You know, maybe we're in a recession, maybe we're in a depression, maybe we're experiencing a global pandemic that is affecting these kinds of things. A while back, I saw somebody post this on Facebook, and you may have seen similar things any given day on social media. Here is an image that says, we are not given a good life or a bad life. We are given a life. It is up to us to make it good or bad. And I think that this is a common view in society, the idea that we focus on agency and we don't think at all about social structure. And so you'll see people say these things all the time. And they often say these things to blame people for complaining about various things. You're complaining about racism, you just make your life better or worse. You decide if you're going to be bothered by that or not. You're complaining about sexism, you decide whether you're going to be bothered by that or not. You decide whether that's going to affect you. And that's not really the way that social structures work. We can't choose the social structures that are going to affect us because we're all affected by social structures all the time. And so this is one of the reasons why when I set up the first day of class that sociology is a particular way of looking at the world, it's not always an easy way to look at the world because we're not used to doing it in a lot of cases. We're used to really thinking about agency, and having to bring structure into that and considering the influence of social structures is something that we often don't do. And And so that's one of the things that makes this class challenging sometimes, is just because it's very different than the way we often look at things, just like chemistry is very different than the way we often look at water. So this will be like the continuing thread throughout the semester. And these ideas of structure and agency are really the bedrock of the class that everything else is related to. So here are some quotes from the reading from last time where Mills is talking about this. So Mills says on page 13 of the reading, neither the life of an individual nor the history of a society can be understood without understanding both. And then his argument is that we need to understand both. So he says the sociological imagination enables us to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two within society. So this is really what we're talking about when we talk about the sociological imagination. When we talk about viewing the world from a sociological perspective, we're talking about not just focusing on agency, not just focusing on social structures, but looking at the influence of both of those things together. We can define the sociological imagination as a class like this. So we can see it as the ability to look past individual action to understand the relationship between human agency and social structures. So even though we're just introducing this concept and it's already the fourth day of class, you've all been doing this already. This is what you were doing on the second day of class when I said, why might Malcolm X have made this statement that whites are evil? And you said, well, let me think about Malcolm's experiences as a Black kid growing up in rural Michigan. How did those experiences shape the choices that he made? How did those experiences shape the attitude that he had about other things for the rest of his life? So that's using the sociological imagination. You're looking at that historical context that a person was placed in and understanding the way that those things relate to each other. So when you're talking about this sociological imagination, you can think about three things. And we talked about these a little bit in the discussion last time. So you can think about the structure, the social structure that is influencing somebody, that person's position within that social structure, and then how that position influences their agency. So let's think about social class. So social class is a social structure in society. But if you want to talk about the influence of social class on yourself, you can't just say social class exists, so I experience this, because there's that middle piece missing. What is your position within the social class structure, and then how does that affect the choices that are available to you? So we can think about different positions. Somebody who is, upper class or upper middle class, that's a position within the social structure of socioeconomic status. Somebody who is poor or working class, that's a different position within the same social structure. So we can think about the fact that somebody who is wealthy and somebody who is poor both exist in the same social structure, but they have different positions and they have different choices as a result. So the person who's wealthy has a lot more choices available to them than the person who's poor. So think about having a car. So it's nice to have a car, you can get around places, but the person who's wealthy has a whole range of cars that they can consider. And the person who's poor might have to go with the cheapest possible car they can find, or they might not be able to find a car at all that allows them to fit their budget. In some places, people can take public transportation. In places like Gettysburg, that's really hard to do. And so that constrains the options that are available to people. Somebody who's a professor in Gettysburg or who's wealthier in Gettysburg, if they have to drive a while for a job, I mentioned last time, my spouse lost her job at the beginning of the summer. She now works in Mechanicsburg, which is up by Harrisburg. She can drive to Mechanicsburg and it doesn't cause us problems. If we didn't have a reliable car and she lost her job and then she got a job offer in Mechanicsburg, she might not be able to take that job offer because she didn't have the ability to get there. Or she might take that job and then lose that job because she doesn't show up for work. So because of the positions within the social structure, the options that are available to us are different. So does that make sense? So this is what we're thinking about with the sociological imagination. We're putting people within these social contexts and thinking about how the social structures affect the choices that are available to them. So it doesn't mean that we don't make choices. We talked about all those social structural influences. Those things influence us, but they don't determine our outcomes. We're not 100% determined by social structures, but they do affect the choices that are available to us. We've been talking about the sociological imagination, thinking about the ways that these things interact with each other. And so I want to talk about something that we mentioned a little bit in class, which is the situation with Malcolm's mother. Before she was institutionalized, when she kept getting fired from jobs because people realized that she was Black. So using the sociological imagination, we can look at her situation and say, well, obviously, she's doing fine until people find out that she's Black, and then she's getting fired. So her structural position in terms of race in the United States at that time period is affecting the job opportunities that are available to her. Without using the sociological imagination, though, people might look at her and say, poor Black woman can't keep a job. And that is a really different interpretation of her situation than we would have if we're using the sociological imagination. So the lack of the sociological imagination can often lead to what we can refer to as blaming the victim. So this is stating that the differences that arise between the victims of a social problem and others are the cause of the social problem itself, which affects the way that we attempt to solve social problems in society. So I think the wording that I've chosen for this definition sometimes makes it a little bit less straightforward seeming than it is. So I want to go through an example that'll help us think through this. So we'll use this example of Malcolm's mother to understand blaming the victim. So we're basically saying two people have a difference, right? One person can find jobs and one person can't. And so in blaming the victim, we say, well, the difference between these people, the fact that one has a job and one doesn't, must be about the person who doesn't have a job. There must be something wrong with that person, and then we try to fix that person instead of trying to look at other factors that might be in play. So we have Malcolm's mother, and somebody who blames Malcolm's mother for her situation. You know, she's trying to raise kids, this widowed woman trying to raise kids, and she just can't keep jobs, might try to do things that address the fact that she doesn't have a job. So they might try to give her job training. They might try to make sure that she knows when jobs are available. So what would this person be overlooking if they're making sure she has job training, if they're making sure that she knows when jobs are available, they're telling her and encouraging her to apply for things? What are they ignoring? If they're ignoring the fact that she keeps getting fired because she lives in an openly racist society, all the job training in the world is never going to help her because they're not addressing the root of the problem. The root of the problem here is racism. And they can keep looking at her and trying to fix her, but that's not going to change the root of the problem. It's possible that if you give her all this job training and you keep telling her about jobs, eventually she'll get hired by a family who's less racist and they'll allow her to stay there. But that doesn't change the situation in society that says that people are constantly firing workers or not hiring them or interviewing them in the first place as a result of their race. So does that idea make sense? The idea that somebody might look at an individual person and say, well, what's wrong with this person? What's causing them to be in this situation? And ignore the social structures that are at play, that are the foundation of the problem. So that's why that kind of affects the way that we attempt to solve social problems. Is an important part of this definition because it's not just about one person's experience. It can affect things across society as we try to look at the wrong solutions for various problems. So to give you a more contemporary example, one of the things that we'll be talking about in the second section of the class after the first exam is education. So we'll look a little bit at education in the United States, and we'll see that schools in the United States are largely funded through local property tax, which means that if you live in a wealthy area, your schools have a lot of money and you go to wealthy schools. If you live in a poor area, your schools typically don't have much money and you go to poorer schools. So the kind of school that you go to in the United States is largely determined by the wealth of the area that you live in. So this means that schools in wealthy areas have more resources, they can pay their teachers more, they can have more computers, better facilities, better sports fields, whatever. And schools in poor areas don't have those things. So they can pay their teachers less. They have fewer resources. Their textbooks are probably older. The students may not be able to take the textbooks home because they don't have enough of them. All of these things that make poor schools a worse experience for kids. When we look at this situation as a whole, the kids in poor areas don't do as well on standardized tests as the kids in wealthy areas. And so people might say, what can we do to fix these poor kids so they get smarter like we want them to? And so they'll come up with programs. Head Start is a program, a pre-kindergarten program aimed at poor kids. And there's nothing wrong with Head Start. Head Start helps kids. They do better in kindergarten when they've had Head Start before that. But Head Start doesn't address the unequal education funding in the United States. It does nothing to address the fact that we have rich and poor schools. So this is another example of blaming the victim and saying, well, let's try to fix these kids. Let's try to make these kids smarter without actually changing the structures that are in place that lead to these different outcomes. Kids, no matter where they're born, have potential for learning. But if you're in a really good place, that's going to increase your likelihood of attaining that potential versus if you're in a place that's falling apart and you can't take the books home with you. So those things are going to affect kids. So a third example of blaming the victim, unfortunately relevant to college students, is often seen in sexual assault cases. The idea that we look at the victim and we say, well, this person was sexually assaulted, that person wasn't. What was this person doing that led them to get sexually assaulted? Our perspective is blaming the victim to say, well, you were wearing clothing that was a little revealing, or why were you at a party by yourself, or why did you drink alcohol when you went to a party where everybody was drinking alcohol? We look for characteristics of the individual and try to come up with something that we can blame. And when we try to solve sexual assault, we often take that mentality and try to prevent sexual assault. So the idea of don't go to a party yourself. Don't go to a party where you don't know the host. Never take a drink that's open from somebody that you know or don't know. Make sure that you protect yourself in these situations. But all of the self-protection in the world, and again, these are not bad ideas. There's nothing wrong with not taking open drinks from strange people. There's nothing wrong with not getting blackout drunk on a Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Monday night. There's nothing wrong with those things. These aren't bad ideas, but they do nothing to address the underlying cause of sexual assault, which is, our perceptions of masculinity in society. And so the same things are in play. We can think about, the problem, who we blame for that problem, and then how we affect or how we attempt to address the problem is all related by a lack of thinking about the social structures involved.